Okay, so we're going to talk about hormones first, and the first thing that I'm going to show you is some notes that will get us started on the basics of animal hormones. So I apologize, I actually forgot my writing pad at in the school building. I'm home today, but I wrote everything down for the last class, so I'm just going to review it with you. Okay, so here we go. Animal hormones. There's two basic categories of animal hormones. There are hormones that are steroidal in nature, meaning they're made of lipid, right? And steroid hormones include the sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen. And they're not as common as the other type of hormone, the protein hormones that are made of protein, like epinephrine. The example we've already talked about was epinephrine, and the insulin and glucagon that we'll talk about today that control your blood sugar. So the thing about the steroid hormones that's interesting, the only thing I'll mention about them today is that because they are made of lipid, then just like the phospholipid tails, right, which form a barrier to almost all things getting into your body cells, a steroid hormone can go right through. That lipid layer because it's made of lipid. So estrogen and testosterone, nothing stops those hormones from going into all of your cells, which doesn't mean they're going to trigger all of your cells, because the protein receptors for them still have to be present. And if they're not present in the cytoplasm, your cell won't respond to a hormone, whether it can get through the membrane or not. But that's an interesting thing to remember about the steroid hormones. We'll talk more about that on Tuesday. The protein hormones are the one you already learned about, epinephrine. Epinephrine is made of protein, so it can't get through the cell membrane. And as we showed you, as Mr. Anderson showed you, the receptors for protein hormones are embedded in the cell membrane. And those hormones can't get into the cell, but they can still trigger a reaction by binding with a membrane receptor and then sending the signal in that way, and then having it amplified and having a final response. All right, so let's talk a little bit about particularly blood sugar regulation. And the two hormones that do that are insulin and glucagon. So this is what I wrote yesterday. They are antagonistic hormones. I mean, they don't antagonize each other. There's no emotions in chemistry. But what they do is they do opposite things from each other, and they work on the same thing. They work on blood glucose, the amount of glucose that's floating around in your blood. They're both secreted by the same organ, by the pancreas, which is this sort of large mottled organ that's right under your stomach. The pancreas secretes insulin if your blood glucose gets too high. And insulin works to lower your blood glucose back to a set point. The pancreas will secrete glucagon if your blood sugar gets too low, like if you haven't eaten in a while. And glucagon will cause the blood glucose to go back up to a set point. That's why they're called antagonistic hormones. They work at opposite ends of the glucose concentration coming from the same organ to regulate your blood glucose. So let's talk a little bit more about that. Insulin is the one you've already heard about. You've heard of insulin before. And that insulin is usually the chemical that a person who has diabetes has problems with, right? Either they don't make enough, or the insulin in their bodies don't properly signal their cells. One way or another, a person needs insulin to lower blood glucose after they've had a meal, right? How does insulin work? Well, the pancreas has a built-in glucometer. It has a meter in it, in the organ, that's constantly measuring the amount of glucose in your blood. And if it gets too high, it secretes this protein hormone insulin. The insulin goes to all of your body cells, particularly your muscle cells, and your brain cells and your fat cells. Those are the types of cells in particular that the insulin is going to affect. And it signals those cells to put glucose channels into the membranes. So cells will only be stimulated to to put doorways, right? Doorways for glucose into their cell membranes if the insulin signals them to do that. So that's how insulin lowers blood glucose, by telling your body cells to say, hey, open up your doorways so the glucose can leave the blood and go inside the cells where it's needed, right? Particularly brain cells need a lot of glucose. The brain is a really expensive organ to run. But that's how you lower your blood glucose, by insulin telling your cells to open the doors for it. Okay. On the other hand, if you have the opposite issue, if you haven't eaten for a while, if you are dieting, or if you just forgot to eat breakfast, your pancreas will secrete glucagon, which is the opposite and partner hormone with insulin. Glucagon is a hormone, a protein hormone, that raises blood glucose by signaling the liver cells to release glucose from stored glycogen. Now that should sound familiar to you. That's exactly what epinephrine does, isn't it? Yeah, epinephrine does the same thing, but under completely different circumstances. Glucagon is released not in times of stress, but just in times of, the blood glucose is low because you haven't eaten in a while, and let's put some back in there, right? Epinephrine is released from a totally different gland, from the adrenal glands, and that happens if you are, if you're in danger, if you have stress signals going on in the body that tell the adrenal glands to get the epinephrine and the adrenaline out. So two very different hormones, but they actually have target cells that are the same. So glucagon is the one that comes from the pancreas and is the companion hormone with insulin. It raises blood glucose by signaling liver cells to release glucose from glycogen. So the glucose goes back into the bloodstream and raises the blood sugar back up to the set point, the homeostatic set point where it needs to be. Okay. So the other thing that I want to show you here is I have some notes on negative feedback. That's it. That's all there are right there on the screen. Many hormone pathways work by a negative feedback mechanism. This is because once you start a response in the body, you need to be able to stop it. So many negative feedback pathways are actually a lot more linear than the insulin versus glucagon antagonistic partner pathway. And since I'm not going to go into other types of pathways here, I only want you to really learn the insulin glucagon pathway really well. What you need to know is that they are negative feedback. They are working in a negative feedback way, that one of them does the opposite of the other, and they are negatively feeding back on each other. So as insulin lowers the blood sugar, if it gets too low, the pancreas turns the insulin off and turns on the glucagon to raise it back up. And that is a negative feedback relationship. They're negative feedback partners, and they're also antagonistic hormones. So I just wanted you to know that, because when you go into the POGO I'm going to assign to you, you'll need to know that. Okay. So just in more detail here, let's say, and this was from the last class because they all said they liked donuts. So I said, okay, well, if you eat 12 chocolate donuts, let's say you guys instead ate a whole bag of gummy bears, all right? Whole bag of gummy bears. What's going to happen first? What is that going to do to your blood glucose levels? All those gummy bears. Yes, it will raise your blood glucose. That's exactly right. Okay, not real difficult to figure that out. They're very good. Okay, so yes, your food is digested, your glucose enters your bloodstream, and it spikes, right? There'll be a spike in the glucose level. What will the pancreas do? The pancreas will detect that high glucose because it measures blood sugar, and it will secrete insulin in response. The insulin will travel to body cells and signal body cells to put glucose channels in the membrane. and this will cause glucose to flow into cells and out of the blood. That's basically it right there. There are the steps of what happens in response to a human eating lots of sugar. Eating a lot of sugar, that's what's going to happen. Okay. Now, in addition to this, if you connect what I'm talking about, this normal blood sugar regulation, think of this from a standpoint of a diabetic person. So the place where a diabetes type 1 person has a hiccup is right here in terms of secreting insulin in the first place. A diabetes type 1 person has some damage to the pancreas or to the pancreatic cells that secrete insulin. Often this is caused by an autoimmune attack. It can be genetically based, and it tends to happen in younger people as soon as they, sometimes when they hit puberty, it crops up. But they are not able to secrete insulin at all in the first place because something has gone wrong with their pancreas. This is different for a diabetes type 2 person. I have diabetes type 2. I make plenty of insulin. My pancreas is fine. I make insulin. That's not the issue. The issue for this second type of diabetes is that my cells won't accept the signal. The insulin goes to my cells and something's wrong with the signal transduction pathway inside my body cells. And it just doesn't do the job of putting enough glucose doorways in my cells to lower my blood sugar properly. Either way, you wind up with a high blood sugar problem if you're diabetic. It's just a matter of how does a doctor treat you? A doctor might treat you differently if you have diabetes type 1 because you can't secrete any insulin at all. Often the only treatment for that is to have insulin injected into you. Diabetes type 2 have more options. There are some medications that have been developed that can fix the signal transduction pathway issues or induce more of the glucose in your blood to be taken and stored into glycogen and taken out of your blood. It's actually what metformin does, which I've been on for years. So, do you have any questions about that? How many of you know people who are diabetic? Yeah, I think just about everybody who has somebody or friend or somebody in your family who has it, or you might even be diabetic too, like me. It's a very common disease in the United States and all over the world, actually. And to some degree, it is genetic and it travels through families. My grandmother had it. All of her brothers and sisters have it. And now I have it. My mother contracted it too. So it's a pretty prevalent thing. And we have developed lots of good treatments for diabetes. That's a really good thing too. But it is still there. And it does matter how healthy you keep yourself, how healthy you eat, whether you exercise regularly, and you guys tend to be pretty good at that. I at least in my experience, the McLean students seem to be eating well. Some of the things that I've seen in Tupperware containers that you bring in look really healthy to me. In fact, I think you eat better than I do. In any case, it's an interesting topic. Okay, so now if I go on to the other situation, if the blood glucose goes too low, then what's going to happen? Like say that you forgot to eat breakfast and also you went through lunch because you were just really busy. Which organ is going to respond to that? Blood sugar getting too low, or sometimes in terms of this, maybe your insulin is so active that it took your blood sugar down too low. Which organ is going to respond to blood sugar that goes too low? The pancreas. Yes, that is it. Okay. And the pancreas will secrete what chemical? Which hormone? Glucagon, yes, nicely spelled. And there is often a lot of confusion between all these G words, so be really careful about that. Glucagon is the hormone. Glycogen is a polysaccharide stored in your liver that's made of lots of glucoses, right? So it's easy to get confused by those things. So good for you for not falling into that trap. Excellent job. Okay. So if blood glucose goes too low, the pancreas secretes glucagon, which does something very similar to epinephrine. It approaches liver cells and induces liver cells to cut up their glycogen and release glucose back into the bloodstream, which raises it back up. Okay, so that's good. Now what I want to do is I'm just going to go ahead and share the video with you that's actually really good at explaining all of this. And it's also, you'll find it at the end of your, you'll find it at the end of your worksheet POGL that you'll be doing today. So I'm just going to go, and my son is laughing at me. I don't know why. Okay, so I'm just going to let this play, and you'll see how the hormone insulin, what its signal transduction pathway is like. This is the detailed signal transduction pathway of insulin. So it's going to be a little bit different from epinephrine. We learned epinephrine was the last one. It is a protein hormone, so you'll see it bind with a receptor molecule in the cell membrane. But then after that, it gets a little bit different. So here.
Hi, this is Mark from the MSOE Center for Biomolecular Modeling. The following animation will show the molecular mechanism whereby insulin triggers the uptake of glucose from your bloodstream. Soon after a meal, the digestive system begins to break down the food you have eaten. The carbohydrates in this food are broken down into a simple sugar called glucose. As this glucose is absorbed from your digestive system into your bloodstream, your blood sugar levels increase. Your circulatory system then carries the glucose to muscle cells throughout your body, where it is used to generate energy. And here's the important part. In order to get that glucose that's now in your bloodstream into your muscle cells, you need to have insulin present to trigger that uptake event. Insulin is a small protein hormone produced by your pancreas. As the concentration of glucose in your bloodstream rises, your pancreas senses this increase and is stimulated to release insulin into the bloodstream. The newly released insulin plays a key role in regulating the concentration of glucose in your blood, a process known as glucose homeostasis. The insulin that is now released into your bloodstream binds to the extracellular domain of receptor proteins found on the surface of liver, muscle, and fat cells. This binding triggers the autophosphorylation of the intracellular domains, which, in turn, phosphorylate a specific substrate signaling protein. This protein then phosphorylates other downhill signaling proteins, leading to an amplification of the signal at each step. This overall signaling process is known as a signal transduction cascade. One important consequence of this signal cascade is the movement of glucose transport proteins, called GLUTs, towards the cell surface. As these storage vesicles fuse with the cell membrane, the number of GLUTs present on the surface of the cells increase, allowing the glucose to enter the cell. As a result, the glucose concentration in the bloodstream decreases. The glucose is now inside the cell, where it can be metabolized to generate the energy in the form of ATP that is needed in all of your cells. And that is how insulin helps the sugar you eat turn into the muscle that you use.
Okay, that was really clear. What I want to ask you before I stop the recording is, what was insulin's final response in that cell, in that muscle cell? What was the ultimate third step, the response of the cell? What did the cell do? At the molecular level, what happened in that cell? That was the response final step. Look. That's it right there. That's the step that happened. Right there. That's it. What's happening there? What's that final response? Yes, that's it. You put gates in the membrane, yes. And what are those gates for? They only let one thing in. What are they going to let in? The glucose. Yes, that's it. You've got it. Okay. So now let me explain. With a diabetic person, this isn't happening, right? Or something's going wrong so that those gates in your body cells, in your muscle, in your brain, in your fat, all over your body, there aren't any gates allowing glucose to come into your body cells, right? So this can be pretty dire in the extremes cases of diabetes. Before we discovered that injecting people with insulin could give them a treatment, a cure for this. Think about people who are eating and eating and eating, and none of that food is getting into their cells where they need it. You can eat all day. If your insulin can't open doors in your cells for the glucose to get into your cells, you starve to death. And that is exactly what used to happen to diabetic patients. And it was a heartbreaking, terrifying disease. So if you can't get your glucose into your cells, you might as well not even eat because your body is starving. The glucose has to get into your cells and out of your blood to feed you. The other reason is if the sugar stays in your blood, you have to kind of imagine this. When if you have a friend or a family member who has diabetes, and sometimes the blood sugar does go up, sometimes you have those days. Or maybe you're in between, you're in a place where you couldn't get your meds or something like that, right? Really high blood sugar is very damaging to delicate organs. Think about your red blood going through all of your tiny little capillaries. There's a lot of tiny little capillaries in your skin, in your eyes, in very delicate organs. And think about if that liquid blood going through there is really, really full of sugar. It becomes almost like syrup. And then it can even come out of solution and kind of crystallize even, so that it's moving like sludge through very delicate, very easy to damage capillaries. This is why people report their vision going blurry if the sugar gets really high. And you can have long-term organ damage, right? Like you can have like the slightest abrasion in your skin, especially people's feet. Diabetic people's feet can get a lot of damage to them, because if you have little abrasions on your feet and your blood is sweet, infectious bacteria love that. Infectious bacteria are going to get into the abrasions on people's feet and cause really bad infections. Even in some cases, gangrene can happen, right? When you have a person whose diabetes has been untreated and they haven't had medical care and medical help. So yeah, if you have really sweet blood, a really thickened blood that's thickened by sugar, that can be a really dangerous thing. So that's why it's really important for a diabetic person to control their blood sugar. So there are two problems. If you can't get the glucose into your cells don't eat, right? They can't function. And if the blood is very syrupy and sugary, that also causes organ damage. Yes. Okay. So I'm glad you're listening. I really am. All right. I'm going to stop the recording.